Welcome, everyone. I'm so excited to have another webinar with you today, and this time joined by my amazing talent manager, Hope Benfield, who's been with us for the past few years and helps me with running the talent team here at TAC Advisors. And today we wanted to do this webinar with you, sort of a state of the union of what we're seeing in the talent space and hiring market. And this webinar was really inspired by the fact that just in the past 2 months, I've had conversations with a few of my candidates, two specifically, who are these incredible individuals, very high level C-level executive assistants who've worked at the kind of some of the best companies in the world, most recently laid off by their companies because they were both at startups that went under, and they're feeling really defeated in this market. And I just so happened to come across right around the same time a podcast episode by this person called the Straight Shooter Recruiter. And during that episode, it was called WTF is Going On with This Job Market. She broke it down some really interesting statistics around the challenges of hiring right now, what she's seeing in the job market. And she actually does recruiting in tech, but it was the same stuff that I've been seeing and Hope's been seeing on the market for hiring for EAs. And so we wanted to have this session to sort of break down those metrics, those statistics, what we're seeing, help sort of level set of what is going on with hiring in the space and with our clients, but then also give you some additional ideas and tips and tricks on ways to separate and differentiate yourself in this market. So before we go into a little bit further, I just want to give a quick reminder for those of you joining us for the first time that Hope and I cannot see or hear you, but hopefully you can see and hear us. So if for some reason you cannot, please let us know. And I'll make sure that the chat is also enabled so that everybody can join and let us know where you're joining us from too, because that's always helpful. And we'll go ahead and get started. So thanks so much for having us, Hope.
Yeah, I'm excited as well. I think, this is a conversation that we have so often internally as a recruiting team. So I'm excited to kind of bring our network into the fold and expand a little bit on what we're seeing and ways that we can assist you in standing out too in this such client-driven market. It's very fast and furious right now.
Yeah. So let's talk about that a little bit and just sort of like the market and market stats. And so I think there's some interesting things to talk about versus location specificity, whether a role is hybrid, in office, or remote, what we've seen in a shift there, also around compensation. And then Hope, you actually have put together and want to share something that we have insight from on the recruiting side since we have access to LinkedIn Recruiter. And LinkedIn just came out with this amazing program called LinkedIn Insights that helps us see sort of the landscape of the market in a very data-driven way. So I know Hope's going to share that as well. But before we kind of go through the LinkedIn recruiter side, I was able to put together for a conversation I had actually with the EA Mafia back in December around compensation and in-office expectations and what we saw from 2022 to even 2023. And I thought the stats were really interesting. And so just on our side at TAC Advisors, what we saw in the amount of searches that we worked on from 2022 to 2023, we worked on roughly 15 less jobs in 2023 than we did in 2022. Now we were still busy, but 15 jobs is, that's a couple jobs a month, less than what we would typically work on. And so there definitely was a bit of a plateau in the market in 2023. Just within the past couple of weeks, I think you'd agree with me, Hope, that like we started to see a pickup again. So I think there's definitely some positive momentum in the market of clients wanting to hire again. We've also seen on the EA Rise and EA Mafia side an increase in companies wanting to spend money on learning and development. And so those trends that we experience when companies are willing to pay money in this space is usually a really positive indication of what's happening in the market. So it's not all doom and gloom. We do see some positive momentum happening, but there definitely was a bit of a plateau in 2023. One of the other things that I think is worth mentioning is the shift from completely remote to hybrid to in office. And so remote roles moving from, thank you for coming, Tasha, from remote to hybrid to in office. In 2022, we actually saw a drop, about a 12% drop of companies that were willing to hire fully remote roles,
Mhm.
and shift those roles to hybrid and office. And then for hybrid positions, we saw 8% of that increase that moved from fully remote to hybrid fall into that hybrid space, and the rest moved to fully in office. And when we say fully in office, we mean 5 days a week.
Right.
Now, that's something that's been really interesting, because on the flip side of that, I think because we had for a good solid 1 to 2 years of fully remote work with the pandemic, candidates are still really vying for those fully remote roles. And I would say probably, and correct me if I'm wrong, Hope, like whenever we're working on a position that is 100% in office, the number one reason why candidates aren't willing to consider the role is because it is a fully in office position. I would say even over compensation.
I would agree with that 100%. And I do think too, it comes down to, we're so used to having the flexibility and the nuances of being able to work at home. But I think too, the caveat to that is sometimes when you're working at home, you're 24/7. And I think that's the mentality too that you need to understand. You're always available, right? My office is just a step down the hall. So if I need to, I can jump on the computer. And so, I think going into remote, what I'm seeing too is candidates want to be remote and they want that, but they also are looking for the work-life balance. And that's a little bit of the differentiator there. So when you want the work-life balance too, I think almost going back into the office is sometimes the better option because a lot of the time there's those set hours and you're able to get back home to the family or whatever else those external priorities are for you. But yeah, I would say over compensation, it's like it's the fully remote. But I think there's nuances to both of those too when you're looking at it.
Yeah. And what I'm seeing as far as even its industry plays a big part on whether or not a role is willing to be fully remote, the level of executive,
Hmm.
and I would say I don't want to say age, although there's obviously a correlation to years of experience and age with an executive you support, but those tend to also be pretty big indicators of whether or not a position is fully remote or if it's hybrid or if it's in office. And so for the roles we worked on in 2023 that were fully remote, they were either in very progressive VC firms where it was supporting an executive who like did not live in the country. And so people, when I say progressive VCs, like they're investing in like psychedelics or like other alternative spaces. They're not like the traditional SaaS, software investing venture capital firms that have been around for 20, 30 years. They're like new funds that are just being spun up. And those executives tend to be a little bit more open-minded in the way that they work with their team. And they don't want to be in person. They want to live in another country and do their own thing. And so they're totally fine with their staff being anywhere. The other thing that I saw that was pretty common is for much younger executives. And so we, quite often work with founders who are under the age of 30 who are starting their first company and they're hiring their first EA and they have a company that's a fully remote workforce or like a very flexible working environment. They're a lot more open to working with somebody in a remote capacity. And that's mostly because if you think about it, their age and lifestyle, if they're in their mid to late 20s, most of their career has been totally remote too, because they started working in the pandemic. And so for our clients that are, more seasoned executives, people who have started multiple companies or been, operating at the C-suite for 20, 30 years, they are most of their career worked with somebody in person, had that partnership with an EA where they sat right beside them and were in every meeting with them and they want to go back into an office. I've had a lot of executives who have families and have young children. And as much as they love their families and young children, they like to go to the office for some peace and quiet during the day.
Hmm.
so so that's why they're going back in. And then they really want their assistant to be there too. So that's another piece. And then the third, I think, common thread of the in-office component is if there's some element of an office management function. So especially with earlier stage startups or earlier stage like venture funds that we've worked with, this is the only admin in the company.
Or the first.
Everybody, like it's the first. And
Yeah.
so everybody else is an investor, engineer, a product person. And so this is the only person to not only do the strategic work for their exec, but also to receive packages when they arrive or when guests come to meet their executives, that somebody has to let them in through security and get them seated. And so those other pieces of the role that are still really important, there's nobody else to do it. And so that's why there has to be that in-office component. So again, I think whenever you're thinking about roles, like what are the trade-offs, like there's a huge perk to working with a seasoned executive who's had an EA multiple times because they know how to work with this person, they know how to leverage them. But the trade-off is they know how to work with this person and how what works for them for the past 20 years. And so they're not as flexible to changing the way they work with this person now. And so that's something to think about versus, you know, there's always trade-offs is the point I'm getting at. Anything you'd add to that, Hope?
I think too, when it comes to like in office versus remote, I think the biggest thing too that we're seeing is really identify like, what does remote mean for this company? Because a
Yeah,
lot of the time it's very geographically notated as well. So we're seeing even a shift away from remote into hybrid or into in office. We're also seeing remote has shifted into geography. So we're looking at founders that are sitting in major cities. And again, right, you want to be near your founder. If you want that true partnership and the strategic way of managing their life, you need to be near them. So they are looking for someone that's either one in the same time zone. So specifically it's, Eastern, Central, Pacific, or they're looking for someone that's in the same city. So it's remote. Yes, you're mostly working from home, but there are going to be opportunities for you to meet with your executive, whether it's an extended lunch or a whole day where you're going over priorities. But we are seeing that specifically. And I think a good way to identify that too, I was just thinking about this recently, is if it says remote right on the location, but then there's a preferred right after, if it says Los Angeles preferred, New York preferred, usually the preferred will mean we want somebody here because this is where our executive is located.
yeah,
And if it's not in the location specificity for the job, look down at the qualifications too, because sometimes they'll notate down there because they want to see applicants from all over that are looking for remote roles. But at the end of the day, there's always some kind of a nuance, especially right now. So I think looking down at the qualifications and seeing again if there's any identifier. Do we want someone Pacific? Do we want someone Central? Is there a specific location? But I would say, I mean, less that we see, less than 3% are fully remote without some kind of identifier.
yeah,
And then I would say after that are the remote roles that have some kind of a location marker attached to it.
yeah. And that's a really good point. Even if it's not a time zone. So we have one client right now that is remote. You have to be in PST or CT. And the reason why is the executive is based in MT and they work really long days. So they're like, we don't want to bother this person at 9, 10 o'clock at night if they're on EST. And it's really like, we want to create some boundaries for them and have it be respectful. And I think that's awesome. But of course, we've had a ton of people on EST be like, but we'll do it anyway. And they're like, we just don't want that type of culture where it's normal for this person to be pinged at 9 or 10 o'clock at night because and solely because it's a time difference. But then they'll also have certain requirements like, well, would you consider people in PST who are in Canada or Mexico? And then they're like, no, it has to be US based. And so that's another thing to consider, like, and look, does it have to be PST in like US headquarters or now I do want to make a point because I have seen stuff about this on LinkedIn of people being frustrated about roles that are remote that are geographically based because it doesn't feel fully remote. Um, and or why would you put remote but Austin preferred or LA preferred? So there's a couple of reasons why companies do this, and I think it's important to know. And it also goes to my next point about compensation. so,
Yeah.
so what we saw in regards to compensation last year is that for 100% fully remote positions, the average salary was $110,000. for like C-suite founder level EAs. At peak, we saw 150K. And then the only exception to that is when we worked with a large public tech company or a family office, and their
Mhm.
compensation was up to 220K. But those were like only two searches that were outliers.
In
And
a
so
year,
in a year,
in a year.
everything else was 110 to 150
Right.
versus the average on-site and in office was 150K with 185K at peak in the major cities like San Francisco, New York, LA, Austin, and even Miami. So you're looking at like a roughly 20 to $40,000 delta in compensation, which for some companies, and depending on what the expectation is of how in person somebody is needed to be to support an executive, they're willing to take a $40,000 change to have somebody else somewhere like that isn't in the same city as them if the person is flexible to fly in from time to time for events, and can be pretty much like available to jump on a plane at any moment. Like $40,000 is a huge savings for them. But if they find somebody who's fantastic in their city, they're going to prioritize that person, right? And so again, it's the trade-off of we're open to seeing in other locations, but we're going to move people who are in the same location in the same place. And I'm going to give a really real life example of something I had to deal with last week. I, when I hire my next executive personal assistant in the coming months, will have this person live in the same city as me. Um, because I have, and there's always going to be a blend. I think there's very few jobs that I think are completely corporate, like not at all personal anymore. There's always something that happens, and I had to sell a piece of real estate last week and 2 weeks ago, and I was in San Francisco, and I don't have anybody there to help me. And I needed to get a notary, and you can't do notaries online for real estate transactions, which I found out. I know it's awful.
Oh,
Actually, have to have a physical person come and do it like printed paper, and you have to sign in blue ink, and you have to also have a witness. So,
okay.
yeah. Um, and I like all of my friends have jobs. Like I didn't have like anybody to help. So luckily, the timing worked out that it then happened when I was in Austin for South by Southwest. And I had to on my own find a notary in Austin. And I just so happened to be traveling with a friend who like was staying in my place with me. And I got her to be my witness and sign. But it was like incredibly not fun logistics to deal with last minute. Um, while traveling and like having somebody that would have been my person in the same city that could have just like figured it out for me and physically come. I know, Jillian. I if I had known, if I
Jillian,
Jillian, I would have called you. I literally almost put a bolo out on like RE. No,
follow out. Yeah.
it was so stressful for me amongst everything else I was doing. It was, I know. And everybody's like, you could have contacted me. Let's exchange.
Everyone's so great.
But I also like didn't want to bother like people that I know. And it was very stressful. And I needed somebody to like print the stuff out because I was also staying in like an apartment that didn't have a printer. I mean, it was just like an entire mess. And so like having somebody who like physically can be there to like print out the documents, be your extra witness, like these are just like random one-off things, but it is
Yeah.
valuable sometimes to have somebody in the same city as you or that has resources in those cities to be able to help you in a pickle. So that is my one. It was a very painful week for me last week. Well, I actually got to see Melissa. It was great. Okay, so we talked a little bit about comp. We talked about on-site versus remote. Let's talk about supply and demand. And like this is something I'm really excited to share because this is a new thing that LinkedIn just came out for recruiters and for people who have a
Mhm.
LinkedIn recruiter, which is usually most recruiting agencies. So I'll let Hope you share your screen and show us some stats because it's a really cool product that they just came out with.
It is really cool. I feel like I want to preface with like, don't get shocked by the numbers. I think there's definitely ways for us to stand out, which we'll definitely talk about right afterwards too. But we did want to give a little bit, is this the correct screen for you?
Yeah.
Okay. So we have right now, so we get this talent insights because we have the LinkedIn recruiter, which is great. So we're able to look at the talent pool report as well. So this is looking specifically at candidates. How many candidates are in each city? How many jobs are currently available? And that gives you an idea of what the supply and demand is for candidate per position, right? So we did a few of our tier one cities and then a few of our tier two. So this one specifically is looking at New York. So if there's anybody joining us from New York, then this is a perfect stat for you to see. There are almost 38,000 of you right now in the New York metro. So that is looking at, New York, Brooklyn, a lot of the different boroughs, Staten Island, even that's including that. And right now there's 546 job postings. That's only looking at specific LinkedIn metrics. So if you're looking at that specifically, also you can go over here and see if there's at least 10,000 of you that are physically open to new opportunities that I can see. So if you're looking at the data between how many of you are looking for a position versus how many positions are physically open, it's a big difference in numbers. And so it's pretty much been kind of a trend through most of the cities. So we'll switch really quickly to Austin. So if you're joining us from Austin, there's about 4,000 of you. I would say Austin has kind of recently blown up in the C-level, founder level, president level. There's a lot of us that did the mass exodus from San Francisco's and some of those other tier one cities like New York, and we all moved to places like Miami or Austin specifically. So we're seeing a bigger trend of executive assistants moving to Austin, but also there's just still not enough volume of positions available. So we still need to stand out as much as possible. So we'll switch again the screen. This one is going to go to San Francisco because San Francisco is a little bit smaller of a city, still tier one, just like New York. But because it's a smaller city compacted wise, we have about 16,500 of you and 284 positions available. So I think we'll talk a little bit about like what are the nuances too of an executive assistant, because not every executive assistant position is formatted the same, or the formula is never the same and it always looks different. But this is just to give you an idea of like how many of you there really are and how many of you are vying for these open opportunities, right? So what do we need to do at the end of the day to really make our experience stand out, to be somebody that's memorable in those interviews? And it does come down to interviews, how you market yourself and ways that you're responding to questions. So we'll jump through that a little bit as well.
Yeah. Okay, why don't we jump to that, like how to stand out in the interviews, and then we can touch really quickly after that on like branding and
Yep.
LinkedIn. So we're gonna switch what we were originally gonna talk about, but since you brought it up, I think it's more
Yeah.
fun to start about like ways to stand out.
Why not?
So let's talk about your resume and applying for positions. And especially if you're applying for jobs on LinkedIn, because the what Hope was showing you on LinkedIn Talent Insights was positions that are posted on LinkedIn. Now there's obviously companies that don't post on LinkedIn and that, you're going to find on other job sites. And so it's not entirely encompassing, but hopefully it kind of shows you that like, it's like less than 1% of positions that are open for the population that is currently looking.
Great.
So, you for your resume, you want to do as strong of a skills match as possible. And kind of to the point that Hope is making about like not all EA positions are made the same, not all chief of staff positions are made the same, personal assistant, like whatever your title is. And so it's always great to have a sort of templated resume, but then you're going to want to tweak and highlight specific attributes before you submit it for a specific role that's tied to the position you're interviewing for. So I'll give a perfect example of a conversation I had with a candidate yesterday or the day before yesterday that was interviewing for one of our public tech company positions because she's worked in a public tech company, but she's also worked as an executive personal assistant for a family, which is like amazing experience, right? The more well-rounded you can make your experience, the better, because it makes you, especially in this job market, a lot more desirable for roles because it shows that you can work in a lot of different types of environments. You're really adaptable. and you have a much broader skill set. And so the job description for the public tech position, she obviously highlighted a lot more stuff metrics wise around her experience working in a public tech firm and going through an IPO and doing board work and things that are important to a public tech company versus the role that's supporting an ultra high net worth individual across her their business and personal side. It obviously still talked about the business focused work she did, with inbox management and with calendar and management meetings, but it also touched on her experience managing private aviation and helping with like real estate transactions, to the same point I made earlier with my own example,
Yeah.
right? And so, like, being able to add an extra bullet or highlight some of those other pieces that are relevant to that position is going to be really key. Also, um, if there's specific tech tools that you use, I think it's always good to make sure that you tie in the tech tools and how you use them,
Mhm.
because this landscape is constantly changing, and so it's no longer sufficient to just be proficient in Google Suite and Microsoft Office Suite. Any other tools that you can learn, like Zapier, like Coda, Notion, Asana, um, Trello, anything like that, and then tying that into your position is going to be really valuable. And then AI tools like ChatGPT. I'm
Mhm.
trying to think of other ones that people use. I mean, we have our own like tech partners like Tango, which is great for creating PMPs. So that is going to help too. Like one of our clients that we're working with right now, everybody at his company uses those tools, but he's a more seasoned executive and he doesn't. And he's very honest about the fact that he is not super tech savvy. And so he's like, oh my God, it would be amazing if I had an EA who could bridge that gap between me and my team, because I know it's a frustration for them. Right. And so being able to be nimble and have that experience and be able to find ways to integrate the tools and get the work done with the team, but like not necessarily totally change the executive's working style is also something that would be really valuable.
Mhm.
Anything you'd add to that?
I was going to say, if you are adding, because a lot of the times, like, of course, add your tech tools. And I think Megan touched on it a little bit when it comes to make sure you're adding some kind of a metric to that, physically add it as a bullet point. I am using Salesforce to track client data, investment opportunities that, make sure you're attaching a reason to it. And I say this too about interviews. If you're going to say that I'm using a specific tech tool, give it some kind of context. So anything that's listed in your technical skills, which we should have there because it's easy to grab, but also add it in as a bullet point of how are you physically using that tool?
Yeah. I had a candidate last year who had actually like counted how many emails she had sent or responded
Hmm.
to, and she had done over 6,000 emails
Yeah.
last year. And that's a really interesting metric, right?
Hmm.
Or another search we worked on last year. It was great because the client could tell us this because we were working with their chief of staff to fill an EA position for them. And she's like, this executive, I have 50 trips I'm planning for them. And this was like back in October between now and December.
Hmm.
50 trips. Like that volume, that's insane. And so being able to show your value and demonstrate that with actual numbers and metrics is super, super valuable. And that actually talks a little bit about interview questions and answering. And so we can kind of transition right into that now. What would you kind of say in regards to like when you're actually in the interview process? What is some great ways to demonstrate your value?
Yeah, I think when you walk into an interview, regardless if that person is an EA or has had an EA before or has done the position that you are interviewing for previously, you always kind of want to walk in there like this person has never done that job. They have no idea what you're doing on a day-to-day basis, and you need to get granular. And by granular, we really mean like pulling out those metrics. I'm running 50 travel itineraries a year, or my executive has 15 board seats and I'm putting those calendars together 18 months in advance. So I think it's really tracking down and looking at your skills. And I think that's something that we forget about every once in a while because it's just the nuances in the day to day of your regular job. But really, like, how many emails are you fielding a day? And being able to explain that to you in an interview is really strong because I think the more vague you are, the less likely you are to move forward. And so
Mhm.
it's like, oh yes, I've done this before. Of course, yes, I've managed my executive's email. It's like I run my executive's email A to Z. I am logging in at 7:30 in the morning, an hour before he's even on site, and triaging to see if anything has come in over the afternoon. I also know that my executive's day changes on a dime, so I'm checking the email every 15 minutes, every hour, whatever it is, but giving them those specific details is what's going to set you apart from others in the interview.
Yeah. And it's actually something, so for EA Rise, our community and professional development networking organization, that we've developed, and we're holding that training on April 17th. And it's called Show Your Value. And it was developed by Jamie Field, who formerly supported the CEO of SurveyMonkey. And for those of you who don't know, the former CEO of SurveyMonkey stepped down, I think about like a year or two ago. And so, in the same situation with the people I mentioned at the beginning of this call, like when your executive leaves or your company goes under, it doesn't matter how great of an EA you are, like sometimes your job is going to be eliminated. And so she had to really sit down and be like, what have I done in the past 5 years of my job to um like be valuable at this company? And so she came from a very metrics driven approach of what we've just been talking about, of the things that she knew were important for hiring managers. And she broke down those metrics, and she uses those not only in her resume but when she's answering interview questions. So we're going to do a training on that specifically within the community, because it is so valuable, and it's something that you can do an entire session on. So
Yeah.
yeah.
I just added it quickly into the chat, just like a quick identifier so you guys know what to look like, but you can follow EA Rise as well on LinkedIn. So it's a good place to just keep up with information because there are a lot of webinars coming up that you can jump in on.
Yeah. And then let's talk about like being prepared and over prepared for interviews. It's been a minute since I've personally had to interview, so I'm gonna age myself for a second, because the last time I physically went in for an interview was like over a decade ago. And so back then it wasn't normal to bring a laptop. I think laptops were like 15 to 20 pounds back
Oh,
then.
yeah. I wasn't bringing a
It was
laptop,
like
but
it was like a brick.
yeah.
But I had like one of those leather pad folios with like my
Yeah.
notes pre-drafted that I wanted to ask for questions. I had physical examples of work product that I had that I would physically like pull out in the
Yep.
interview. And so luckily nowadays laptops are like what, 5 pounds maybe if you have like a MacBook Air. I mean, they're not that heavy. And or you can still like pre-print your questions and have like physical copies if you're physically going in. But if you're doing a Zoom interview, it's super easy to pull up, a sample travel itinerary that you've done, just scrape any information that is confidential, but you can use the same like framework or template. If you've put together any like decks or materials, if you've done any type of marketing content, like whatever, if you know it's
Letter.
important and it's highlighted in the job description as something they want to do, maybe a template of
Yeah.
an agenda that you make everybody complete before going into a meeting, having that prepared and literally in the interview being like, oh, I'd love to show you how I do that. Can I share my screen really quick? Is going to blow their minds, because the best indicator of future success is past performance. And the fact that you were clearly prepared for the interview and the meeting, and you have that work product ready, you're just leaving no questions. It's clear you can do the job. And a huge part of being an amazing EA or chief of staff is being prepared for meetings. And so
Yeah.
you're demonstrating that even walking into that interview.
Hmm. And I wouldn't say that we're asking anybody to do something that we wouldn't do ourselves, right? Megan and I sat down yesterday for a full 40 minutes and did a full rehearsal, and I have notes open. I'm ready to go for this. If there's anything that's missed, we can pick it up for each other too. So I think, I'm not going into this as like a recruiter on the other end, like this is what you need to do to be ready. I would do all of this myself, and I would never ask anybody to do anything that I wouldn't personally do. But this is just what we've seen has been the most successful
Yeah.
previously, especially in this market. So I think that's why we want to call it out.
Yeah. Oh no, I prep for everything.
Yeah, I have to.
Everything has an agenda.
Yeah.
everything has materials prepared and everything has been rehearsed. I actually had a funny conversation with from that I met an entrepreneur that I met at South by Southwest last week. And he gave me like a sample of, I'll actually show it, I'll promote it for him. It's called Vibe It. And it is a chapstick that is supposed to be, I don't know, it's called Lip Balm with Vibrathol. And he wanted me to try it. It's like a company that he just invested in. And it actually does, like, it makes your lips feel like really good. It has sort of this like tingly essence and it's supposed to be like really healing. Um, but he was like, would you do some type of like video promotion or like testimonial? And I was like, sure, but I'm traveling right now. I won't be in front of like any good lighting or camera until next week. And like, what a Zoom suffice. And he was like, nobody else is taking this as serious as you. And I was like, I do nothing that's not excellent. And I'm like, and I'm sure that's going to stick with him that I was like, set expectations. And I'm like, I will only do like it's my brand too, right? It's not
Mhm.
only his brand, I want it to look good, it's my brand. And so I think if you're always thinking that way of like, how am I constantly showing up in a way that's excellent? I think that that's what people remember.
Well, and I think too, going into it, I mean, I don't know if anybody else feels like this. The more unprepared I am to go into a meeting or an interview or a speaking engagement or whatever, the more nervous I am. Like moments before, I'm like sweating. I don't feel good. I didn't prepare for this. So I think just even an abundance of knowledge, you can have, there's never a point where you can have too much knowledge on the company or what you're looking at or what you want. Your experience is unique to you, so you should be able to explain that tenfold. But I think it goes the other way too. So for any client or a company that's looking for candidates, if you feel uninterested or it's like you haven't done the background screen right of them too, then you're a little less likely, or I would say less likely to move forward. But I think it goes with everything in life too. I'm the same way. I prepare for like everything
Yeah.
too.
Now, one thing I will say for people who are, because it's different, there's one extra sort of value add of working with recruiters when you are interviewing for roles. Because if you're just applying directly online for a position, right, you're kind of going in blind. You don't totally know what to expect as far as like what the interview process is going to look like, what the interview questions are. And so one thing I will say is that, you know, I don't want to say most recruiting firms. I only know about a couple that I've worked in and Hope's worked in. But, for us at least, anybody who works with us, we know what the interview style is going to be like. We
Mhm.
generally know the questions that are going to be asked because they've interviewed other people. And so we try to gather that information and give you that as a heads up so that you can prepare for that too. Like if we know what questions they're going to be, you can role play those. We know typically how many interview steps are going to be and the people you're going to be meeting with, because again, that knowledge is power, and being able to adjust the questions that you're going to ask the company based on the person that you're interviewing with, whether it's the VP of talent, the CHRO, the executive, the EA, like all those questions and the way you approach those people is different.
A little
And
different.
so, if you are working with a recruiter, ask them if they have that information that they can share with you in advance to help you be more prepared.
Mhm. I would say too, kind of shifting gears a little bit. I mean, we're still on the topic of questions, but I think too, this reminding you that this is also your interview. And so coming prepared with questions yourself is hugely important. I always say at least write 5 to 8 down because a few of those will be organically answered during an interview. But coming with questions that are more than basic level, right? Like they scratch below the surface for this. You want to and tailoring it to who you're interviewing with. Again, if it's the HR head, if it's the executive himself, if it's another EA team member, you want to kind of dig in a little bit to understand, what is my expectations? How do I best be successful in this role? But you want to ask them in a way that gives you more information and also doesn't sound like, these are things that we should have already covered in the first 30 minutes of this call. So you do want to stand out pretty heavily when it comes to questions yourself. One thing I've seen when it comes to like unpreparedness, right? If we're talking about that, one is having no questions at all, just not having them and saying that out loud to an interview is a pretty big red flag, and likely to have you removed from the process pretty quickly. I would say if you have an interview that's maybe a little bit shorter, 30 to 45 minutes, and you know that that time is really short, getting to the end and that interviewer says like, is there anything left that you have for me? Always ask questions. Always say like, yes, do you have time for questions? I think that's a big indicator that you are interested in learning more. Even if they don't have a ton of time, it still shows that you're willing and wanting to learn more from them. And then another thing that would be is the questions are too vague. It's again, it's something that you would have asked or they would have gone over in the first 30 minutes. So it's like, can you tell me about the company culture? Like that's a little bit too vague. It's like it's surface level. Let's try to dig in a little bit more.
So Hope and I prepared, I'm going to drop them in the chat.
Yeah.
Four really solid questions that you can ask in an interview that are very strategic, but are also going to give you information that, oh, sent it to you, Hope. Sorry, let me send this
That's
to
okay.
um, that I think will be really helpful, and they're strategic questions, but it's still going to uncover important information. So I want to walk through those really quickly and the reason why we think they're great questions to ask in an interview.
Mhm.
So I usually ask this when I'm initially taking a search when I talk to a client, because it's really helpful for me to understand exactly what this person's going to do. And quite often, if I go into a meeting with an executive who's hiring, and I ask them like how they view the role, if it's the first time ever hiring for this position, they're like, I don't know. So you want to start with their pain points. And so saying like, what's the biggest pain point I can immediately take off your plate if I started in this position, right? That's the low hanging fruit. What's like the easy thing you can immediately tackle to show
Mhm.
impact and make them feel really confident in your ability to do this job. And then, like, what are some immediate projects that need to be addressed, right? So, are there things that have been like continuously put on the back burner because they haven't had this person that, again, you could immediately jump in and start doing to make an impact on their life, right? Um, the next one, what are your expectations for this position for the first 30, 60, 90 days? And what would I need to complete or do that would impress you? So
Mhm.
again, putting like a time period on it of like in the first 30 days, what do you want me to do? I actually did this with an executive last year, and and he didn't have an answer. He's like, those are really good questions. Like, let me go back and kind of think through all the things I want. And then he came back to me after the fact with a working document of his priorities and what he'd want this person to do in the first 90 days. And then what I did is I was like, okay, great. I want to like actually set expectations on what's realistic for you. And so let me reshuffle these priorities for you and what I think this person can actually do in the first 30 days, first 60 days, and first 90 days. And then these things here actually need to be longer term projects, right?
Mhm.
But again, like not everybody has me as a recruiter and a talent person to do that with them, right? And so, especially if you're applying for a job directly, this might be a conversation for you to have with the executive, or whoever the hiring authority is, and you can play that role that I just played. And if they're like, I'm not really sure, then you can ask some of those like following up questions of like, again, like what are your biggest pain points? What are things that have been on the back burner for you? Um, and you can make some suggestions like, if in the first 30 days I just got through your inbox and I started categorizing and flagging like things that haven't been responded to in the past 30 days, like because let's say you have 10,000 emails, you're not going to get through 10,000 emails in 30 days, but you might be able to get through the past 30 days worth of emails in 30 days, and categorize and respond. Like, would that feel like a win for you? Right. And so you can have that conversation. You're already showing up like a strategic partner to that person when you're in the interview process. Hope, what other ones would you suggest?
I think kind of piggybacking on that too is, after looking at what would impress you at 30, 60, 90 is what does your onboarding look like at 30, 60, 90s, or by the time I hit 90 days, what will my have training look like? What does my ramp up period look like? What are you expecting from this person? I think it's important to look at that too. Like, if it's more of a startup, they might be a little bit more hands off with their onboarding and hoping this person can come in and be that 90%. They're ready to hit the ground running. And then you just have to, I call it the isms. You have to learn like the company isms is the last 10%. And then another one would be my favorite question to ask actually is who else should I speak to internally about this position, right? And everybody that you speak to on that panel might give you a different answer, and maybe the person that they say isn't on the panel of interviews So if you do make it to like offer stages or final interviews and they say, is there anything else? Or if your recruiter asks you, is there anybody else that you would like to speak to? I would 100% ask for that person every time because they might give you a different perspective. Maybe you missed them in the interview panel. Maybe they have more of an idea. Maybe they're in the role and they can tell you what the day-to-day looks like. But that's always one of my favorites is who else do you think personally I should be speaking to? Because they might give you a different answer. You never know.
Totally. Yeah, and I want to underscore the reason why both of those are important. So what does onboarding look like for the first 90 days of employment? And I would say, and is there any onboarding? Because it's okay if there isn't, but I just want to know what I'm walking into.
Yeah, fair.
Because going back to if it's you're the first person that G&A hire at a company, or you're the first person building this family office from scratch, or the first person, there may not be an onboarding. In which case, now there's another way for you to demonstrate your value. If you've done that before and you're like, this is, I've had to set up my own job, and I walked in on the first day and had to set up my own benefits and buy my own laptop. I can do that. You can say that. You can say, hey, it's okay if it isn't. This is what I had to do in my last job. I just want to understand like where we are in the process of this position so I know what needs to be done in the first 30 days, right?
Right.
And if that's not what you want, and you're like, I want an actual onboarding, I want to work with an actual team, I want there to be structure, you also know what you like don't want. And if they're like,
Mhm.
there isn't anything, you're on your own, you got to figure it out, then this
Right.
might not be the job for you. So
Mhm.
you're uncovering two very important pieces of information of like,
Yeah.
is this a good fit for you? And also, it's opening up a talking point for you to again demonstrate your value in the interview process.
And I
Uh,
think too, if you're not talking to your recruiter about this, because I will say I've worked with other agencies before, but not everybody gets as granular with details as we do at Tech Advisors, and we will ask some of these really like nuanced questions. And I've had candidates before say, I've never had somebody go this deep with me. I've never had somebody ask me about an understanding of what I want out of an executive or what I'm looking for day to day, or if I want a small team or a big team, or if I need an HR department already implemented. So I think too, if you're not talking about this with your recruiter, start talking about it with them so that they have a better understanding too of how to steer the train at the end of the day. But I do think that's what sets us apart.
okay, perfect. All right. So let's talk about really quick because we promised we said we talk about mistakes before we
Yep,
leave because we're like almost done. I can't
we're
believe
getting
this
close.
hour's flown by. So
Woo.
so let's
Yeah.
talk about some just things that we've been told more recently from clients that are mistakes in the interview process
Mhm.
that aren't I don't want to say like common mistakes, but like more recently that we've heard. And so we've already talked about the importance of being prepared. Um, and that could be like physically bringing collateral, whatever it is, but also just physically bringing stuff to an interview, especially if it's an in-person interview. I've heard from two different clients that before they brought us into the process and they did their own search, that they had candidates go on site for interviews and literally bring nothing.
Right.
They just showed up to the interview, no notepad, no laptop, no nothing. And they said, this job, part of it is like being the note taker, right? It's being the person that's in the room, like leaning in and making sure things are being followed up on. And so they do want to see that. Like that is
Mhm.
something that clients have said that is important to them. Having examples prepared and then also understanding the business. And so you don't have to, if you're interviewing for a role with a cybersecurity firm, you don't need to be an expert in cybersecurity, but you should at least have an understanding of like who are their competitors. Why is the space important? Like, has there been an uptick in this industry more recently due to any type of like economic factors? And so those are like basic things that a quick Google search or a chat GPT question probably could answer
Mhm.
for you that just gives you a little bit more knowledge into that. Um, let's see. Do you want to talk about aesthetics? I think that's important.
Yeah, I would say any kind of like loud or distracting aesthetic, and that can go from background to what you're wearing, loud noises. I've had somebody in the past had their TV on pause and it unpaused itself during an interview. So just turn the TV off, turn the phone off completely. I just turned off my Slack notifications for the next 2 hours when I came onto here. So I think that is important as well. You want to make sure, if you're coming off as I'm the most organized person, you want to make sure your background also looks organized. I can't have 7 doom piles behind me and say that I'm the most organized person in the world. So I think whether you use a normal background or like Megan is using one from Zoom, either one is fine. I think we would just ask or that we notate that you don't want to use anything that's like outer space, a landmark. I've seen a lot of the Golden Gate Bridge. I've seen space, I've seen cats, I've seen donuts. Just like opt for something that's a little bit more office focused, library focused, like something a little bit like that. Because if I didn't know Megan and I didn't have regular meetings with her, I would have thought that was her background. I really would have. So and then I think too, aesthetic wise, if you are somebody who wears makeup, just trying to be a little bit more like neutral in that, no like huge, large dangly earrings. An interview is usually not the time to like test out a bold lip, or like a really long fingernail. You just want to go in and you want them to really focus on your experience. I think like it comes down to that at the end of the day. So anything that can be distracting. I'm a hand talker, so even this in a Zoom, some of you would probably be like, "Oh, it doesn't bother me at all." But then there's probably some of you thinking like, "I wish she would just put her hands down." So I think like that's what you have to remember is the person on the other side of the screen from you is everyone's going to be so different and they're all going to take things differently. So while maybe Megan doesn't care that I talk with my hands, and some of you don't care that I talk with my hands, others of you might be thinking it's super distracting and I wish she would stop. So I
Yeah.
think you have to go into it like that. And I think that kind of goes with like body language as well.
Yes,
So
I was just gonna say that. Let's talk about because I wouldn't say it's a mistake, but it's a missed opportunity.
it is.
It's a
Yeah.
missed opportunity, and that I literally just had a client mention this yesterday that they met somebody who they think totally had the experience, but they didn't feel like they had the fire in the belly for the
Mhm.
position. But I know this talent manager in-house, and she's like has kind of a direct, high energy approach to the way she communicates. So when I communicate with her, I'm direct, I'm high energy, I lean in. But
Mhm.
the candidate is very calm, like very low emotive, which can be great. And I think it would actually be great with the executive, but since she didn't turn that on in the
Yeah.
interview and lean into that, like you have to mirror the person you're
Mhm.
interviewing with because you have to get through the gatekeepers to get to the principal you're actually supporting. And
Mhm.
like if they're leaning in and they're putting their hand on their face, like you should lean in and put your hand on their face.
Right.
And I remember talking about this. We actually did a training about this in my college because I went to school for hospitality management. So there's a lot around customer service that this like mirroring body languages and communication style. And this was a whole topic of discussion. And I remember somebody in the class being like, that feels so fake. And they were like, don't think of it as that. Think of it, it's called context switching, or it's called maybe I'm saying forgetting the name of it now. Maybe it's not context switching, but it's actually like a psychological thing that you do where you adjust your communication style, you adjust your body language, you adjust your energy to
Mhm.
match the person that you are working with to make them feel more at ease. And
Yeah.
so it's something that constantly has to be practiced. And the way
Mhm.
that I like interact with Hope is very different than the way I interact with Rachel on my team versus how I interact with Kelly who at EA Mafia. Like they're all very different. And I adjust the way I work and talk with them based off of what I know works for them. And I think is a really great EA or chief of staff, that emotional intelligence and the
Mhm.
way that you adapt and are a chameleon to those people is super important.
Yeah, I would say it pays off tenfold too once you're in the position because your executive is likely talking to tons of different key stakeholders at different levels in their own company. So just being able to be that chameleon and just jump in. But yeah, I think there's always something to be said about those like old timey sayings. It's like birds of a feather flock together. It's true. I mean, it really is. So, I mean, Megan and I have both been kind of like relaxed most of this call, but I have been mirroring her this whole time to see what she's doing. And I think too, just kind of remembering that throughout. the interview process too. If they're more relaxed, be more relaxed. If they're more emotive and they are excited and outgoing, then kind of match that too. Because I think when there's such a difference in that, it's tough to kind of move forward. Like Megan said, you're speaking with the gatekeepers that get you to the executive. So you want to align with them too as much as possible.
Yeah. All right, last two, which are actually interview questions that we want to give you a tip on answering.
Oh, yes.
Um, how do you stay organized? Hope, how do you stay organized?
Well, I can tell you the wrong answer.
Yeah.
Because as much as I am maybe a pen and paper person, that is the wrong answer in an interview. And we have a lot of us that are organized by pen and paper, but it really is like, again, getting granular. So we want to see that you can demonstrate that you use different tools and technology to stay organized. Are you an inbox zero person? Are you a calendar color coordinated person? How do you manage your executive's meeting time? Is he 45 minutes, 25 minutes, and gets a buffer? Yeah, I think those little types of things stand out. If you're a task management tool, you're using Asana, you're using Notion, how are you using CRM? I think it's when you get to the how do you stay organized and you give, if there's a vague response, they have to have a follow-up. You want to avoid them having that follow-up question, right? So how do you stay organized is a vague, give them something granular that dives into your how do you set up your day? How are you organized around your executive's time allowance? How do you set up the calendar? How do you set up email? Is there any other tech tools that you were the administrator for or that have, you've set up personally? So I think just diving into that question full out versus leaving it with maybe like one or two items is
Mhm.
important.
Yeah. All
But
right.
yeah,
And then
never pen and paper.
and you can do, I literally
I do it as well.
use pen and paper.
Yeah.
And I also have things saved in my Slack and I put reminders on my calendar and we use as a team Trello to like for
Mhm.
projects that involve other people, right? And so it's we're not saying pen and paper is bad. It's like writing down is a real study of a way to be able to remember things.
Of course.
But you also have to remember that like if you go out on vacation, the world doesn't stop because everything that needs to be done lives on your pen and paper, right? Like
Mhm.
how are things being communicated and shared cross-functionally so that the world doesn't end when you leave? And so that's what they're looking for in this answer. All right, last one. How do you prioritize your day?
I prioritize my day based off of my executive.
Yeah.
So versus having something that is very concrete
Mhm.
of, 7 to 9, I'm doing this, 9 to 12, I'm doing this. Then I take an hour lunch. I think especially in this position, your executive's day changes on a dime and it can. And sometimes there's a cascade of it, right? Throughout the calendar. If one meeting is missed by 15 minutes, you can probably assume that most of the other meetings after that are going to need to shift a little bit. So I think, again, it's prioritizing your days based off of what your executive's day looks like. What immediate fires came in over the evening? What needs to be finished absolutely before the end of the day? So I think just renegotiating what those priorities look like with your executive on a constant is how you can prioritize your day. And that's
Yeah.
how I would go about it.
And if you have any type of sort of ethos or if you've had a conversation with your executive on what an ideal work week looks like for them, or if you're part of those conversations about their metrics or goals for the year, if they have OKRs that they are supposed to be sticking with, that's a really great way to say, my executive and I like tie all of their meetings to their OKRs. And so if their goal this year is to hit X amount of money in sales, like we've agreed that um, 80% of their meetings for the week have to be client facing. And so whenever new meetings come in, I triage those requests and those priorities based on is this tied to this OKR? And if
Mhm.
not, they get pushed out. And being able to speak to that specifically and say those metrics in an interview is going to make you show up in a very strategic way. All right.
Love it.
That's
We're at time. I
an
can't believe it.
hour. It's crazy. It blew by so fast.
Yeah.
Well, I really appreciate you doing this, Hope, and I really hope for all of you that stayed on this that this was helpful and gave you some additional nuggets of wisdom. Um, we're here if you have any questions or you need any support. This will be sent out over email. But really hope that this was helpful for all of you and appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.